All right. So here we go. Let's start talking about our views of nature. So this course is obviously titled Environmental Imagination, and a big part of our concept of the environment has to do with how we imaginatively conceive of the natural world. And so I'm going to go through and give you a little history on what some historical views of nature have been, how those have changed over time, and end up with sort of a bit of a basis for where we are now. We're going to spend a lot of the semester looking at these ideas and how they've transformed over the history, specifically of American literature and early, well, not just American literature, but early European literature too, to some extent. So here we go. All right. So where do our views of nature and the outside world come from? And I'd say for most people, first and foremost, family is obviously going to be a very significant aspect of how we view nature. If we come from a logging family, we're going to have a radically different view of the natural world than if you grew up in New York City. And those are going to just your family background, your life experiences are going to dictate to some extent your view of nature. So that obviously those are pretty pretty obvious. But from a larger standpoint, a lot of our views on nature actually come from Greek myths, and Greek mythology is going to have a pretty big role in this. We're also going to see a lot of influence on folklore. And when I say folklore, I'm going to include everything from Celtic folklore all the way to contemporary Native American folklore. And we can say this is kind of Euro and American folklore are gonna factor in pretty substantially. And then another one that we obviously need to address here is how Christianity has influenced our view of nature. And so that's kind of where we're headed today. So here we go. If you have any questions, obviously you can always send them to me, and you can always post questions in our weekly Flipgrid regarding any of this. Happy to chat about it. All right. So first off, we need to look at animism. And what is animism? And animism is basically a quick summary here. The Latin root anim means mind or spirit. This Latin root is the origin of a good number of English vocabulary words, including unanimous, animated, animosity. The root anim is easily recalled via the word animal, and for animal, living, moving, spirit, and mind. Some definitions also have breath in there. To breathe life into something is to animate it. And so animism, however, is a little bit more complex than that when we start looking at concepts of Greek mythology. Greek mythology goes back really deep into the history of Mediterranean cultures. Many of the Greek myths that we find, even at the time they were being recorded into the Iliad and the Odyssey, were stories that were already, in a few cases at least, a couple thousand years old at the time that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written. And we're starting the city of Minos or Minos, the Minotaur. We are finding from archaeological evidence the great historical depth of these stories. And so it starts to beg some questions. Where did these stories come from? What do they mean? And um, the animism that we see, and animism is to give animal-like qualities again to something that isn't necessarily, or life-like qualities, spirit-like, mind-like qualities to something that doesn't inherently or objectively have spirit or mind. And so one of these obviously is here in the Clash of the Titans. We see the actual personification or the animism of a volcano. And if you are an early Mediterranean person, and we know there are a number of volcanic eruptions, some of them quite cataclysmic for the Greek Isles. that were to go off, that would be a completely unexplainable event. It would be something that you would have no scientific framework to understand. It simply was that the earth was angry and the earth was violent. And you do understand, as a person in the Mediterranean world at this time period, you do understand angry people. And so to animate the volcano into an angry human-like god with vengeance and violence, it becomes quite comprehensible at that point, instead of something that's so powerful that you can't even comprehend. Turned it into a big angry guy who throws fire all around, and all of a sudden, after it's animated, it becomes a little bit more comprehensible. And so when the 12 Olympians were fighting the Titans, a lot of mythological historians will argue that the volcanic eruption around Crete at this time period of early Greek Mediterranean history, the clash of the Titans was actually about this geological event that we know occurred. And so that's where animism then comes into the nymphs. And we have obviously lots of history throughout Greek mythology of nymphs. There are river nymphs, there are forest nymphs, there are all sorts of different nymphs who embody the spirit of different natural elements, mostly benign and babbling brooks and stuff like that, or a lake might have a nymph associated with it. And the Greeks actually felt as though there were these spirits in many cases, especially the early Greeks, that were actually associated with these natural entities in the world. So we can obviously see here when we look at Gaia, and Gaia is when in today's place where we have Mother Earth. She's often associated with fertility and the concept of life giving, that mothers bring care. She's in this picture. Obviously, she's holding the earth. So Gaia, and then here we have Narcissus, and Narcissus, as we know, was a young man who was so enamored with his looks that he continued to stare into his reflection in the water for so long that he turned into a flower. And so our Western cultural history is ripe with lots of examples of animism. Animism is, we can see it everywhere. Many of you have probably referenced as a kid, the man in the moon, is we are personifying or animating the moon, which is this far off large rock that is sometimes bright in the sky. And yeah, there's a face-esque looking aspect to the moon, but we put a man in the moon. And now all of a sudden, not man on the moon, but a man in the moon. And this is an example of animism. So, mild example, but we have many of these. So we'll continue to look at these. Just this is kind of deep cultural examination of this. But moving on to the next one is we have personification. So personification is a little different, but it's important to, and I've mentioned this a couple times, but it's important to include here. And as you can see, personification is the attribution of personal nature or human characteristics to something that is non-human, or representing the abstract quality of a human form. So like the early Greeks trying to understand the volcano, they would also attach these to other abstractions, not just physical abstractions, but sometimes things like in the case of Athena here, wisdom. Wisdom is sort of a hard abstract concept to really grasp. But when you take wisdom and you bake the notion of wisdom into this very wise, battle hardened, but not cruel woman who is Athena, it becomes attainable, it becomes approachable. And so the Greeks frequently use personification. Here we have Aphrodite. And as we know, Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty. And once again, beauty is a complex concept. It's not the same for everyone. And so what do? We wrap it into a character. And then we have that character romping around Greek mythology doing various things. And as a result of those characters' actions, it helps us better understand the concept of beauty. And then over here, obviously, we have Zeus. And so Zeus is, again, the personification of many things, as many of these gods are. They don't necessarily personify just one abstraction, they frequently personify many. Something interesting that the Greeks did is the Greeks were not interested in having infallible gods. Their gods were all terribly human, and they made all sorts of human mistakes and errors and jealousies and infidelities and overreactions. And so the Greeks could feel, in their particular case, very close to their divine personifications because of their frailties rather than their perfection. Kind of a different, different structure than what we see in Christianity often. So moving on to the next one here, let's look at Aristotle. So Aristotle, and you're going to see in the video this week if you've watched it already or one of the YouTube documentary videos, Aristotle came towards more or less the end of the Greek era. He was a contemporary of Plato. He was one of the tutors for Alexander the Great. Many call him one of the key founding fathers of Western philosophy. And instead of having an abstract notion of animism and personification that we saw throughout the rest of Greek culture, he started to promote a more structured way of examining and investigating nature that was systematic. So basically, as we can see, I wouldn't call him necessarily the father of the scientific method, but we start to see the scientific method and a scientific way of looking at nature, because we know nature, as science's main goal is to examine nature and to come up with concrete understandings of what's happening in nature. We can't look at nature, especially in our contemporary world, without including an element of science. Science goes hand in hand with an examination of nature. And you'll see in some of the chapters here in Overstory that there are, this will be examined, especially with our character, Patricia, or Patty Westerford. She starts out as a scientist and then goes on from there. All right. So moving on. Here, the next one I want to look at are some Christian views of nature. Christian views of nature are complex, like many of these. They're not stagnant. There's not one set of Christian views on nature. In fact, there's like many different religious approaches to anything. There are kind of contradictory notions or different notions at different times through history. So let's take a look at a few of these. So the first one, obviously, you go right to Genesis. And in Genesis, we have Adam and Eve, and we have the fall from the Garden of Eden and original sin and the tree of knowledge, Satan. And Garden of Eden is this Edenic place where everything is perfect. And this is one view of nature that Christianity kind of continually bumps into. And it's the view of nature as equals perfection. The problem is, though, that as humans in a Christian world view or creation story, is that they are not allowed in that perfection anymore, that they've actually been thrust into the wilderness, and somehow the wilderness is a philosophical antithesis to this perfection. It's decidedly not this perfection. And so the wilderness is a form of punishment for original sin. And this creates, right off the bat, a pretty complex dualistic notion. And throughout Christian interaction with the idea of nature, we'll see one as perfection and we'll see one as punishment. And one where, in both places, obviously, the devil can reside and Satan can exist. But in wilderness, we'll see, like for those of you who've read the book, the play The Crucible, the wilderness is where the young girls go to do demonic things and to interact with the devil. Many horror stories, which are based on romanticism that we'll get to later in the course, but a classic horror story scene is somebody running through the woods being chased by some unknowable beast. And that unknowable beast represents the sublime, it represents danger, death, maybe an element of evil. Well, in a horror movie, almost always an element of evil. And so, and within that wilderness is where that evil resides. And if you go into the Sherwood Forest, you are bound to, something bad will happen. So, just keep an eye on that because these two are both going to be going back and forth constantly. And then another question that comes out of Christianity, especially once again right out of Genesis, is that people bring up is, does dominion over nature come with responsibility, or does it only come with reward? And obviously, there's a lot of different takes on this. Like at what point does controversial act like clear cutting cross the line of humanity's responsibility to nature and the proclamation that God has given them nature to have dominion over. And so this comes back to the question that will come up later. This will really start to appear after a move away from strict Calvinism, and we'll see this later on. Is nature is an exemplification of God's beauty. And in this particular case, which is pretty different than nature as a punishment for original sin, is that as people move through the natural world, they're actually moving through God's creation. As they're moving through God's creation, that creation ought to be appreciated and cherished and responsibly taken care of. And so these are all different views. We'll look at how these views get shuffled around, historically speaking, from the Enlightenment to the Romantic period into our modern era over the next few weeks as we move through the course. All right, moving on to the next one and last one. I just want to show you a quick clip from the movie Legends of the Fall, classic movie set in Montana by Jim Harrison. This is Jim Harrison. If you read any biographical information, apparently he's quite the character. And here's a quote that I found today. The simple act of opening a bottle of wine has brought more happiness to the human race than all collective governments in the history of Earth. Jim Harrison wrote this book, and this book takes place right around the early 1900s, and it is set around Choteau, Montana. And obviously, Brad Pitt, Anthony Hopkins, and Aidan Quinn are the leads in this. If you haven't seen the whole movie, I highly encourage you to, but just give you a little bit of background. In one of the opening early scenes of the movie, the Brad Pitt character as a young boy who has a very close relationship with a Native American gentleman who lives and works with his father on the ranch. He has not a blood battle. He has a bloody encounter with a grizzly bear. And then years later, they find that bear again. And that's the scene that I'm going to take you to right now. But I want you to look for animism. I want you to look for various roles in nature. Do we have dominion over nature? Do we have companionship with nature? What's our role with the natural world? I think it's all pretty well illustrated in this scene here. Here we go. All right, I know the volume is going to be a little tricky. I think you're going to have to turn the volume up when the video begins.
I don't know why Tristan did not kill that damn old bear. The old ones say when a man and an animal have spilled each other's blood, they become one.
I said 4 beers.